But I say sovereignly slammed because it was not beyond God's eye, that God knew exactly what his plan was. And so I just knew that God still has a purpose for me. And I felt like half of me is ripped away, and I don't know what's left. But whatever's left, I want God to be glorified. I want to finish well.
And welcome once again to another edition of Footnotes. Pastor Mark here, and in the studio today, my longtime, how old do you want to be, Joe? My longtime old friend. Is that good?
I knew you were going to call me old sooner or later, so you got that part done.
Oh, gosh. Joe Hale is with us today on Footnotes, and I'm excited to hear his story about experiencing God. And I think if you listen, it will encourage you in your faith, and it will encourage you in your own personal walk experiencing God. But let me introduce Joe Hale for anyone who doesn't know him, and they say, why would I listen to a podcast about Joe Hale's life? Well, first of all, Joe, God's used you in many titles and positions and ways, but one in particular that most people in our area would be aware of is you were the founder of the Network of International Christian Schools, NICS. And you were involved with that for many years, still involved, but you're just not in a leadership position. You were at Broadway Baptist Church for years as a member. You were even on the Pastor's Council, which that doesn't exist anymore, but there was one time a Pastor's Council, and it was leadership. You were involved in that. And as you say, you were even on the board as the missions pastor for 2 years at Broadway.
Yes.
So you had a long relationship with the church. A lot of people and know you. And anyone who knows Broadway knows that for many years, Broadway was hand in hand with you with NICS.
Yes, in many ways it was. And because it was also serving as my sending church, there's just so many people at Broadway that I feel so endeared to and so close to and love so much. It's really, in many, many ways, it feels like my home church.
And your mother and sister still go here.
Yes.
So you have to be on your P's and Q's with that.
Yes.
So the Lord has used Broadway, used you, used the relationship. There's a connection there with many of our members. But you and I, meet decently. We're neighbors. Mm-hmm. So let's go ahead and say that. We live next door to each other.
Yes.
And we talk quite a bit.
Yeah,
you'll ride your bike over, or we'll go out to lunch or something like that. And
you really need to cut your grass a little more often.
Oh, I know that. And so my other neighbors let me know that. I've got 2 boys, and they do try to cut the grass, but they don't do it the way I would do it. You just got to let them do it, though. But yeah, we're neighbors. We talk quite a bit, and we have a history. I taught your son Wes and his wife Hillary in school. Took them on took Wes. I can't remember if Hillary was with us, but I took Wes to Russia on a mission trip. Long relationship with you guys through Young Life. Remember we had the Young Life meetings at your garage?
Yes, that's true.
And so back in the days when I taught at SBEC, you were there and your family was there. And so we knew each other from that past, and then we became neighbors, and you had the connection with Broadway and NICS, and we knew each other from that. And so we've just done a lot of talking. And one of the things that I've been so encouraged by is your story. And, I was telling Joe before the podcast, I like to record these stories because we never know, what God's going to do in your life. Joe, you may go somewhere else, and we may not get the opportunity to hear your story. And I want to preserve it because I think it encourages people to experience God in a very real way. It's a phenomenal story. And you and I were talking one day at NICS, and I said, man, I want to get this story on a podcast. Would you do that?" And then we ran into each other at Kroger, and I said, "How about Thursday?" And you said, "Okay, I'll be there."
Yeah.
So here we are.
Yes.
So we're gonna divide your life into 4 seasons, because our life is basically seasons. Ecclesiastes 3. The season of saved by grace. I'd love to hear about your salvation testimony, how you were saved. Then there was a season where you saw where God was working, and that was the season of NICS, where it's a phenomenal story how the Lord opened the doors for that. You weren't seeking it, but God showed you, and you responded to that. Then there's the season you call sovereignly slammed, where you lost your wife, you had liver issues, but amazingly, the Lord brought you through that. And then you're looking at the next chapter of your life, and this is the most exciting to me, because there at NICS we were talking, and you said, "Mark, I'm 70 years old, and I've got 10 good working years potentially left. While I can still do something, I want to do something for the kingdom." And so you're seeking God in what's next, and there's some exciting things on the board there.
Yes.
So I would think any young believer listening to this could hear your life and go, wow, if the Lord could do that in this guy's life, in some way the Lord could use me, and I want to be available to the Lord. I want to be used. And an older believer could look at your life and say, it's not time to quit. It's time to keep going, right, until the Lord calls us home. So let's tell your story. You ready?
Yes. I would like to say this, though. When you say your story, my experience has been that when you really learn to experience God in your life, that your story and God's story merge into one and the same. And so I like to call it God's story.
Absolutely.
But he let me be part of it, so it is my story too.
Yeah, amen. All right, so the 4 seasons. Let's go with season number 1. Sounds like a hotel, the 4 seasons. The 4 seasons, saved by grace. Let's talk about your salvation and how God rescued you.
Okay. Without going into great detail about it, I was born in Tupelo, Mississippi. My parents lived in Etowah County, Mississippi. We were a poor family. My dad was the county bootlegger and sold whiskey and drank whiskey.
So he was the mayor. No.
Anyway, he died when I was just 3 years old. And so my mom had my sister and myself, and she was trying to survive, and she was working as a waitress, and got into a quick, very bad marriage after my dad died. But it moved us to Memphis, and then that stepdad drove off in his truck one day and never came back, and it was one of the happier days of my family history. And then shortly after that, my mom married my stepdad that many people at Broadway grew to know and love, because after he came to know the Lord, his life was just transformed, and Broadway had a lot to do with that. And so he was called Burl. Some people called him Donzel, but he was after he came to know the Lord, our family changed drastically, because he drank a lot before then, and there was a lot of fighting in the home. So I grew up in a pretty broken down home kind of environment. But God, in his grace, when I was 10 years old, we had moved out to Fraser. And I thought, because we moved from North Memphis to we lived on Breedlove in Chelsea, right in North Memphis. Most people wouldn't drive there at night these days. But we moved out to Fraser, and as just a little ignorant boy, I thought we had gotten rich, because it seemed like we were moving to the suburbs, and so there was a gentleman starting a church in a house that actually the backyard of that house connected with my backyard, and I was playing out in my backyard one day and in my fort, hiding, and with my stick gun shooting people's legs off. And that went by. And all of a sudden, this big guy that went walking by, I didn't even know that he could see me. And he started walking straight toward my little fort. And he looked through the crack and met me right in the eyes. And I'm like, hi, I just shot you with my stick. And he said, I'm a pastor, and I'm starting a church right here in this house. Do you go to church anywhere? And I said, no. And he said, would you ask your mom if you could come and visit here? And I said, sure. And I thought that'd be great, something to do. And so I started attending church for the first time in my life, and I started hearing the gospel. And when I was just 10 years old, I responded to a gospel invitation and asked Christ to be my Savior, and really changed my life. And shortly after that, my sister got saved, and then my mother started coming to church again and renewed her commitment to the Lord. And we were praying like crazy that my stepdad, Burl, would also start coming too. Eventually he did. And then he got his life kind of straightened out with God too. So our family drastically changed after he came to know the Lord. And so when I was just 13, I felt the call to ministry, but I was scared to death of the very thought of getting up before people. It just petrified me. So I thought, well, I can be a minister of some kind, but I don't have to be the one that preaches. And so that's what I was thinking. And then when I finished high school, I went my first year to Tennessee Temple University in Chattanooga. And then I wanted to go into youth ministry, so I transferred up to Liberty University in Virginia and was a pastoral youth major. And my senior year of school, I was in a singing group there that traveled with Dr. Falwell and represented the school and was recruiting students. And after my graduation, that singing group was chosen by the school to go on a trip to Asia. And that probably is the open door to phase 2 of my life.
Now, when did you meet your wife? At Liberty?
Well, I was at Liberty. I was working my way through school, and my job caused me to have to go to her office from time to time. But somehow, ignorant me, I thought she was married. I never had the first thought of dating her. And then one of the other secretaries that worked up in our office area said, Joe, I think maybe she likes you. And I said, she's married. What are you talking about? They said, she's not married. And I said, oh, okay, because I was kind of interested in her too, but I just thought she was a very nice married lady.
Yeah.
And so I start my senior year, I started dating her. And so...
You were married how many years?
We were married for 46 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So the Lord calls you to ministry, you go to Liberty, then you come to this phase of your life where you're going to go plant churches overseas. Is that correct?
Well, as I had no really great plans, specific plans for my life. I was looking for a job in a church somewhere. I wanted to go to a larger church as a youth minister. And when I went on this missions trip, we went to 4 countries. Most of the time was spent in South Korea. And while we were in South Korea, God just absolutely broke my heart. That's why I'm such a fan of short-term missions trips. I hope that's not all that we do as churches, but provide people an opportunity to get outside of this country and see the needs of the world, because I really believe that the eye really is the window to the heart. And so on that trip, I just saw masses of teenagers and started asking myself the hard questions. Why do you want to go to a big church? what you want to have a youth center with a fireside room and all these things you had planned. What about these thousands and thousands of kids you've been singing to in these big rallies and at all of these schools? And what about them? And I started just searching my heart, and I just said, God, I want to be willing to go anywhere and do anything that I can do. So we were out on this dried out rice paddy as a group in Korea, and the sponsor of our team that made up all of our schedule was planning to build Korea's first youth camp in the country. And this was 1977, and so we were joined in a big circle, all holding hands and praying and dedicating this land for the building of this youth camp. And here I was, a youth major, and experiencing all these kids coming to Christ through our rallies, and still looking for a place to go, and I'd already just graduated. So it was like, I got to get this trip over and get back and get a job, and get my place of ministry. So I was really searching for God's direction for me. And so I took the two hands that I was holding and joined them to each other, and I kind of left the group and walked down a path, just needed to get alone with God. My heart was just beating so loud, I thought the people in my circle could hear it, And God was obviously doing a work in my heart. And so I got alone and knelt down out in that rice field, away from the group, and just said, Lord, if you want to take all of my plans, if this is what you're doing, and you want me to join you here, then I want to be fully willing to do that. And so during that time, I knew in my heart that that's exactly what God wanted me to do, is to be a missionary to Korea. And so I prayed and asked God if he could use me in that. I dropped out after 2 weeks of Spanish, and I'm like, how in the world am I going to be able to learn an Asian language, And how, I didn't really like the food that they were feeding us. And I just, culturally, it was just miles and miles apart from how I grew up. And so I just thought, I don't think I can do this, but if this is what you want me to do, God, then I want to be willing to do this. And so I committed right there to come back as a missionary. I was still single. And so I started writing Anne from Korea all these postcards saying, when I get back, let's meet. I had just told her before we left that this is probably the end of us.
No.
And so because I thought I was moving to a different place, and I certainly didn't think I was ready to get married, but while I was in Korea, somehow God made it clear to me how much I really cared for her and loved her. And so I started writing her, and it confused her terribly.
She said, I thought I got rid of you.
Yeah,
and now you're back.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so when I got back, from the trip, I told her, I said, I'm going to go to Korea as a missionary. And, I really love you. And if you're willing to have an Asian honeymoon, it'll be a one-way ticket.
All right. So that was that season of your life where you were saved by grace, you were called by grace to do missions. So the next season of your life, you head over to Korea, right? You're a missionary there, and you are going to start to see God work, as Henry Blackaby would say, where God reveals to you something that wasn't on your radar. And that you have a choice, am I going to respond in faith and obedience to that, or am I going to try to keep my own plans? And this is interesting because God calls you over there, but yet this one particular niche that is needed, you start to figure out So let's talk about this season where you're going to see God working, and He's going to move you to start working in the Christian school ministry.
Yeah, actually, I have to be very honest and say that I did not look at the situation and figure out a need. I'm too dumb for that, I guess. But I was desperately looking for an education for my children. God blessed us with 4 boys, kind of stair-stepped. And by the time the oldest one got near school age, we were kind of desperate for options. We didn't know anything about homeschooling. And frankly, that we didn't think that was a choice that we desired. And we just didn't know what to do. We checked into the options that were available to us, and nothing looked good. Sending them to Korean schools, just the systems were so totally different from what they would need in preparation for college and those kinds of things. Plus, culturally, our kids were blonde-headed, light-skinned little boys, and they came home every day with red cheeks from people thinking they were so cute, that they had to pinch their cheeks, and so it would be difficult for them to go to Korean schools. So we were trying to find options, and so I checked into the international school that was nearest us, and it was a wonderful school. It was previously started in North Korea as a missionary kids school, but it developed into a very, very fine international school. It was about 1 hour one way from our house to get there. And then when I went to check it out, I found out that the tuition was more, for one child, was more than my whole income for the whole year.
So that was not going to be an option.
That kind of answered the question.
Now, just to clarify, because I've often tried to sift through these terms, international school. So an American listening to this might say, what do you mean by that? Because we really don't have those here.
Right.
But overseas, there are the local, for example, Korean schools. But like you have said, and I want to touch on this, different countries have different structure. So like in Europe, you only go maybe to a certain grade, and then they pair you off depending on if you're going to continue to go on in college or you're going to do a trade. So, I've often been told, like in France, there's a particular way they do it. And so not everybody just goes on to college like we do here in the States. And so what you're kind of indicating is in Korea, there was a different system. And if you had gone with that system for your children, had they ever come back to the States to go to college, it would be difficult in the translation of that. So you say international school. Explain that.
Yeah. That's a great question. When people live overseas, and the numbers of people that do that are just exponentially large these days. For instance,
and that's due to things like FedEx and business, and so they're transferred overseas. Walmart, whatever.
You've got embassy family children and all embassy staff, which is sometimes 30 or 40 families. Their children are with them overseas, so they need to go to an American system, English-speaking school. And so not only that, you've got the independent, individual Pakistani businessman that wants to have a Pakistani restaurant in Seoul. And so he leaves Pakistan and goes to Seoul, and his family is with him too. And these are people, for instance, a city like Seoul, which is 9-10 million people, has at least 100,000 foreigners that reside in Seoul. And so from those families, the needs of their children's education, we only have like 5 of these international schools in the United States because this is an English-speaking country, and the common language for international schools is English. And so English has really become the common language for the whole world. For instance, I have a son that lives in Malaysia. In Malaysia, there are three major people groups. The 60% of the country are Malaysians. They're Muslims. They speak Bahasa. The 30% of the country are Chinese Malaysians, and they speak Mandarin or their home Chinese language and English. And then the third 10% of the population are Indians that were brought in because it's a British colony to help build the infrastructure of the country, and then they stayed there. Their common language, they speak Hindi and English. So the way these people all talk to each other is in English. And so English is kind of the common language, or you might even say the second language of the world. And so when foreigners, when a family moves from one country to another, the common language is English. And so they usually speak English at least as their second language, and they can communicate well in English. So these international schools cater to these expatriates that are living abroad. They're not just Americans. They're not just British. These are corporate people. These are big company people. Like you mentioned, FedEx has offices all over the world. So does 3M. So does General Electric. All the major companies of the world, have people that are overseas operating in every country pretty much.
So you go to South Korea. There is no international school near you.
Right.
It's an hour away one way. Tuition is so high, you couldn't afford it for your kids.
Right.
So there is a need. You didn't expect this. This is not why you thought you were going to South Korea, correct?
Right.
That's what I love about your story. You're over there thinking, okay, God, this is what I'm going to do for you.
I'm thinking, I have to find some way for my own kids to get an education. And so really what I thought the right answer was to try to find a teacher who could come and teach my kids and a few other missionary kids that were kind of a one-room schoolhouse idea, that we could pool our funds and pay the teacher just a low salary, but someone that knew how to do a one-room schoolhouse. We thought that was the best solution for our need. And so that's exactly what we did. My wife's cousin was a school teacher who had gone to a one-room schoolhouse in Iowa, in the country, and knew exactly what to do. And so we had 8 missionary kids from kindergarten through 9th grade, all in one room. And she came over, she sold her furniture, sold her car, basically sold her house, and came over and with 2 suitcases and said, "Where are my kids?" And so we got one room in a building that we rented. It was in a basement, actually. And she started in 1983, one teacher with 8 missionary kids. And we thought, okay, now I can get back to the main ministry, and I've got this problem solved for my kids, and I can get back to the main ministry. And, I kind of jokingly say God has to speak to me in 2x4s, right between the eyes. I'm saying the main ministry, and God is saying, I'm changing the main ministry. That's my call, not yours. And so we had those 8 kids, and people started coming with their kids to drop them off. And we said, no, we can't do that. We don't have a school. We only have a teacher and 8 kids, and we're not really operating a school that's open to everybody else. But the calls came in, the people came in. In the city where we were living, there were lots of American GIs that had married Korean wives, and they had children, and they got reassigned to Korea, and they're going to come, because it's her home country. And there was no U.S. Army schools up in our area. So these kids were just kind of buried without going to school anywhere. And they found out that we had a little one-room schoolhouse. So they came wanting to put their kids in there. So I thought, okay, this is a real need and that God has put before us. So we need to think about not just doing something for our own kids. Maybe I could find a couple of more teachers to come, and we could spread the kids and group them more close to their age groups, still have multiple grades under one teacher. And so we put together a little pamphlet saying we're going to take 30 children, and each teacher will have 10 children. And on paper, it looked beautiful. And we pre-registered 30 students, and we had them all divided up. And on the first day of class in the fall of 83 kids showed up on the first day of school. And we were just panicking, like, what in the world are we going to do with 83 kids? We had planned for 30. And our plan looked so good on paper, but it was like, okay, God's doing something here that's not according to our plans, but he wants to do something different. So
God just briefly, let's talk. Your plans were you were going to go to Seoul, Korea and do what? That was your original idea?
Youth ministry. Yeah.
Okay. So you
I
were
was
going
to help build that youth camp.
Okay, so you'd gone over there not necessarily as a pastor or church planter, but you were going to do youth ministry. So you get over there. Were you supported? Were people supporting you, or did you have an agency or something like that?
So we raised $1,000 a month.
Okay, so you were self-supported.
There we were.
You get over there. You've got these little boys, and you go, okay, I've got to do something for my kids, and that just morphs. And now kids are coming to you, right?
Yeah.
And you have the opportunity to have Christian education. So it's not just education, it's biblical education. So that school grows in South Korea, correct? Now, as it grows, you tell the story that the Lord, you kind of thought, okay, we've got this one school and we're doing a good thing here. And maybe that would have been the end of the story, but the Lord kept bringing even more opportunities to go outside of Korea. You mentioned that there was a man, right, from Indonesia, a general or something like that?
He was a general from Thailand, a 3-star general, and he had his students in my school. This was a Buddhist family. And he came up to me one day and said, Mr. Hale, I want you to know, it was at a soccer game. He said, we've been reassigned to go back to Thailand. And he said, we don't have a school like this in Thailand. He said, would you please consider putting a school in Thailand? Well, we were right in the middle of developing the whole concept of NICS. And so he said, if you can put a school in Thailand, I can help you. And so he invited me to come to Thailand, and we were conceptually putting the whole NICS idea together. And the first appointment I had in Thailand was with the permanent secretary of education, with the 3-star general sitting beside me. And before we left the room, he said, well, Mr. Hale, if you want to put a school in Bangkok, he said, I'll make sure you can get a permit to do that.
So that kind of opened the door to go outside of Korea. You
Right.
got a second school, and then it just kind of bloomed from there, right?
Yeah.
So eventually you come back to the States, and you start staffing these schools. NICS, one of the missions, is to get Christian teachers, train them, and then staff these Christian schools.
Right. We're placing about 100 teachers a year right now, new, into the schools. So when we say train them, we realize they're already certified teachers, and they're already trained in education. So we bring them to this area, to Southaven, Olive Branch area, every summer for about 10 days of specialized training for how to deal with third culture kids, which are the kids we're dealing with. These are kids that don't feel totally like they're part of their parents' country. They don't feel totally like they're part of the country they're living in. They're called third culture kids, and that's who our students are.
Yeah. So you came back over here, you started staffing these schools, and for somebody that doesn't know what NICS is, it's become a pretty large international Christian school organization.
Yes, and we have, when we opened our school in Kabul, Afghanistan, which we operated for 10 years, the American school there, we realized that we couldn't go into places like that and call it NICS, Network of International Christian Schools. It would close the door if we used that name. So we have a second name that we call Oasis International Schools. So our schools that are in Muslim countries, communist countries, sensitive access countries, missionologists would term as, special access or creative access. We use the name Oasis instead of NICS.
Yeah. So I've been to 3 NICS schools in my lifetime that were overseas. Some of them may still be in the network, some may not, but one was in Belém, Brazil.
Yes.
One was in China, Kunming.
Yes.
And I think about those schools that I visited that were NICS, and, I can say very much they were Christian schools.
Yes.
They would teach Bible.
Yes.
They had a plethora of students coming, like you said, from all over the world. A lot of these teachers would go overseas from America and teach. And they got international teaching, but they also had a ministry. So really neat opportunity for people.
Yeah, and it's been one of my lifetime dreams that NICS would have an international school stateside, just so people could see a little bit of what we're operating overseas. Because if they could get there and see it, you start to really, it comes together what we're doing. When you put Christian teachers and mix Christian students in with non-Christian students, and the cultural differences and honoring the culture and teaching cultural things about your host country, all those dimensions kind of come into play. It provides an environment that is amazing for opening opportunities to share the gospel. We had a kid from the little country of Qatar. He was the son of the ambassador. He came to Korea on assignment with the embassy of Qatar, and while he was in our school in Seoul, the son came to know Christ. Very difficult to go to Qatar as a missionary, or if you get there, to have access to anyone to share without getting put in jail. Mm-hmm. But here the kid from Qatar is in Korea, comes to our school because it's got a good reputation and has opportunity to hear the gospel. So when this kid left Qatar, he wrote me a note. He said, to whoever started this school, he was an amazing kid, He said, thank you for starting this kind of school and letting people like me come. And he signed it, the Arab Followers of Christ. It was amazing. Just
the Lord redirected your path, opened doors for you that you had not planned on or thought of, and that went from not only Korea, but it went to Indonesia, and then it just kept spreading and spreading. At the height of your time overseeing NICS, how many schools did you have internationally that you guys were staffing with teachers and training, and you were helping, and it was your network?
Yes. Over the years, we've had, I think, 23 or 24 NICS schools. Now, some of them, like Afghanistan, had to close. Right now, our school in China is struggling to stay open because the government is just cracking down unbelievably. We've gone from over 200 students to just a few students because we can't get ways to get the teachers in there. And so, it ebbs and flows a little bit, but right now, NICS has 13 schools in 12 countries, I think it is. And so, opportunities open all the time, and sometimes existing situations just change, and we have to flow with that change.
But there were times when you had 23, 24 schools internationally, all Christian. You had to staff those. You had to make sure they had the right teachers because the mission was to share the gospel. So those teachers had to be trained. And one of the things Broadway was key in is we were part of that training. You would normally do it here in the summer.
Yes.
And so anyone who's not familiar with PFO, and they don't call it that anymore, but you guys would do pre-field orientation. You would do it for about 2 weeks.
Yes.
You would train these teachers from all over. They would come here to our city. A lot of times they were sleeping in our church on cots and mattresses and in the classrooms, and then you guys would meet in the sanctuary and you would train them and you would talk with them. So you weren't just gathering quote-unquote Christian teachers and sending them. You were training them. And and that's key, because I think people hear that and go, yeah, but how did they share the gospel? What were the specifics? You guys really took a lot of time before you sent them every year in the PFO, and they're still doing that. Just this year I went over to the Whispering Woods, or whatever they call it now, in Olive Branch, and I prayed and was part of the final ceremony where they're sending all these new teachers out globally. And it was just really neat to see everybody gathered in that conference center, and they're all getting ready to go to their different places in the world. So
we have about 900 teachers now, and because of the coming and going, not everyone stays their whole lifetime overseas. We are presently at a place where we need about 100 teachers every year.
So any teacher, any person who said, man, I'd love to do something like that. I mean, over the course of my time, even teachers at SBEC.
Yes.
Remember Alicia
Castillo?
Yes. She went to Broadway, and I was in the college ministry with her for years, and she went with us to China when we went to see Eric Alfrey, who had been the elementary principal at SBEC. And he and his wife had gone over, Martha, to Kunming. And then Alicia went with us on that trip and felt God calling her to leave teaching elementary at SBC and go. And I want to say she went to Kunming.
Yes, she did at first. She ended up in Korea, in Seoul.
And so, these people go, man, this is an opportunity for me to go overseas and do some missionary support work. And so people may not realize it, but you're constantly recruiting teachers and you're training them and you're sending them over there. So it's a neat little ministry right here in our backyard. Right here in our backyard that maybe people are not aware of.
Someone said to me the other day, NICS is the best kept secret in DeSoto County. And I'm kind of like, oh, no, we don't want it to be that. We need to change that.
Right. So you did that for many, many years, and then you got to kind of the age where people retire. Let's move into that. You got into what you call sovereignly slammed, because the first thing that happened is you had liver disease. Is that what it was?
Yes. I had stage 4 liver failure. At my first diagnosis, I realized I had cirrhosis, and I knew something was wrong. I'd gone on a trip to Korea, and I got very, very sick. It was during COVID, so we were being quarantined. I was with my wife, and my body just shut down, and I knew something was wrong. So as soon as I got back from that trip, I beelined to the doctor because I knew something was wrong. And so after several tests, they diagnosed me with cirrhosis. And so it was either get a liver transplant or plan to die, because there's no cure.
Well, and that's where I come in back to the picture, becoming your neighbor. And, Joe Hale looked yellow. He looked thin. He looked pale. He looks nothing like the guy I'm looking at right now. It's a transformation. It's amazing how the Lord rescued you. everyone thought, and you've said this, so this has come out of your mouth. Everybody thought you were going to die.
Yes, I even, somebody said, you're the ultimate control freak. I even planned my funeral because I really thought I was going to die. And I wanted my 4 sons to preach my burial sermon, my funeral sermon. And I knew unless I planned it out and that was my request, they would never want to do that.
Yeah.
And so I planned out the songs I wanted sung, and, I was really planning to die.
And you thought, okay, life is over, ministry is over, and this went on for, over a year?
Yes, I was very, very sick for a year.
Yeah, because I'm thinking 2020, 2021, I remember the summer my kids came and picked the blackberries in the rain, and you were really sick and said, take all the blackberries you want. So then suddenly you get this liver transplant.
Yeah.
And it's one of your friends.
Yes, a co-worker at NICS, actually, Tim Mutter. My doctors at Vanderbilt said, it's not looking real good that you're going to be high on the transplant list, because normally you have to wait for someone to die to get a liver, available for transplant. And they said, why don't you consider doing a living donor transplant where the liver actually can reproduce itself. It's the only organ in your body that can do that. And so they said we would take half of the liver, and then theirs will grow back, and yours will grow to a full liver.
Wow.
And so what do? You go on Facebook and say, hey,
anybody got a
exactly.
liver they would do without?
Yeah. I need one. It's like, and it's a burden to put on your family, So I thought, well, I'm willing, but how in the world how do you ask someone for a liver? And so I was contemplating that, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to the place
that may I have
advertised. Yeah. And so I had some friends that I went to school with at Liberty that said, Joe, how can we help? Can we help you find a liver? And I said, well, the problem is in our group, we're all too old because you have to be under 60 to donate. And so they put it out anyway on our Facebook page from the people that went to school the era that I went to Liberty. And sure enough, word spread, but no liver. And so then I took that same letter and I said, some friends of mine have put this letter together and I just want to share it with you. And I sent it out to my support list. And Vanderbilt, I found out later that Vanderbilt said 13 people contacted them to see if they were a match to donate a liver to be considered. And so Vanderbilt took those prospects and decided that Tim Mutter was the best match for me. And he said, I think God wants me to do this. And so he gave me half of his liver, and he gave me a whole new life.
And in the midst of all this, where people thought you were the one that was going to pass away, your wife ends up getting sick and passes away.
It took me about a year to regain my strength because the liver disease eats away all your muscles. They're still there, but it eats away all their vigor and their strength. And so she was helping me recover. And she had osteoarthritis. She had 10 different joint surgeries. Her ankles were going. And I was getting healthy again and saying, okay, what am I going to do? I'm not going to sit back and just die. I've got new life, and God did it for a purpose. So I got to live my life for his purpose. I got to find out what it is. I thought I would probably go back to NICS and work, and that door did not open for me. And so I said, okay, God, what is it then if it's not NICS? And that was a heartbreaker for me because that was my whole life, So when God closed that door, I was just saying, okay, what am I supposed to do now? Do I know how to do anything else? And I was getting stronger. And I came to a point where I realized that my wife was getting weaker and weaker. And so it was real hard for guys like me to come to a place to be at peace with the possibility that maybe God just wanted me to serve my wife for the rest of my life as my new calling. And I was wrestling with that and coming to peace with it. And God gave me a wonderful bride who spent most of her life serving me and the ministry God called us to and our boys. And so I thought, well, I'm going to be pushing her in a wheelchair. She was real close to being in a wheelchair. And so I was coming to peace with that. And then we had a celebration of my recovery, and we went on a cruise. And at the end of the cruise, we both got COVID. And she got really sick, and I got over it in a few days. And she got really sick and never got well. And so she kept getting weaker and weaker, and the doctor said long COVID. We didn't even know what that was, but that's what her diagnosis was. Come to find out that no one ran a new blood test, and so they didn't discover that she really had leukemia, and it was undiagnosed. And by the time we found out that that's really what her problem was, I had taken her to the emergency room the day after our 46th anniversary on a Monday, and she passed away on Sunday. So we had 6 days after we knew what her diagnosis was, that it was very, very aggressive, and she was so far gone that she couldn't survive it. And she got pneumonia, and it just got to where she couldn't function. But the Lord gave us I spent the night, all night with her every night for those last 6 days. And it was a precious, precious time for us. And then after she passed away, I'm kind of like, now what in the world do I do? The last 3 years were just, I say sovereignly slammed because I truly felt slammed. This direction, that direction, this closed door, just one thing after another. But I say sovereignly slammed because it's not beyond God's eye, that God knew exactly what his plan was. And so I just knew that God still has a purpose for me. And I felt like half of me is ripped away, and I don't know what's left. But whatever's left, I want God to be glorified. I want to finish well. And so her passing actually opened up some other opportunities for me that were unexpected, because I was really at a place where I was ready to just push her wheelchair and love on her and take care of her as my bride. And then God chose to take her suddenly away. So it's hard to not have anybody to argue with, or an opposing voice ever. So, I really miss that.
Yeah. So once again, the Lord kind of comes into your story, rewrites it in a way you had not imagined. Everybody thought you would be the one that would pass away, exactly. And yet she did.
Yeah.
So now we come to kind of the last thing that's encouraging to me. You're now seeking the will of God for what's next.
Yes.
So the Lord has kind of written your story all your life. You're 70 years old. And in the middle of all your sovereignly slammed moments, you were riding your little bicycle thing. What is that thing? It's got like a motor.
An e-bike.
An e-bike. You come over to my house. I'm in the backyard cleaning out the pool. Joe comes up, says, "Hey, man, I saw you were working, and I wanted to talk to you." I said, "Come on, grab a brush." But we start talking, and you tell me, I think God wants to use me to do something else. and I'm willing to go wherever. That's amazing. Most people at 70 would be like, I quit. But that's not where you're at. So tell us what God's going to potentially do next. And this is amazing because now you're a widow, and you've been kind of sharing with me, you know, I don't have anybody I've got to worry about. I don't have to think about XYZ. I'm free. But for you, that translates, I'm free to do anything God wants me to do and go anywhere he wants me to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope I could be that way if I were in that situation.
Well,
I would probably sit and sulk, but I would hope that I could be that way.
I believe deeply, Mark, that if we can just connect with what God's doing, I hate the word retirement. I don't find it in the Bible, but I also think that finishing well looks different for different people. I don't expect every elderly person that's single now, that's lost their mate, to head out to the mission field at 70. It's kind of a crazy idea. But at the same time, if I'm able to do it, and if I can only do it for 5 years, don't we want every day of our life to count for eternity? Right now, I spend a lot of my days in my garden, and I try to use that as time that I can communicate with God and talk with God, and then use the fruits of my labor to bless my neighbors and my family and people at church. But at the same time, is there something that God might have for me that could have more impact on eternity than having a nice garden? I'm not against having a nice garden or people that do. I'm not against people that retire and enjoy their retirement. I just believe deeply that we all have to have the goal of finishing well, whatever that looks like to each individual. And it's not going to be the same picture. It's not for everyone. But right now, I feel physically strong enough, and I think there are many opportunities overseas because there's such a shortage of the gospel that a 70-year-old can be used maybe overseas more than here. And I just want to have a meaningful life that makes a difference for eternity. And so I've put myself out there, and God is giving me some opportunities. I'll be going to Malaysia for the month of October to candidate for an international church in Malaysia. And I don't know where that's going to lead, but if God closes that door, you know, when I say sovereignly slammed, I feel like when God gives you a series of difficult experiences in your life, it either is going to harden you or it's going to drive your trust in God's sovereignty at a deeper level than you've ever experienced before. And that's what I want so much, that I can have such a trust in God that if this opportunity in Malaysia closes for me, I don't feel like God's will is closed, that I'm just looking for what is going to open. I'm looking for what door it is that God will put in front of me if that one closes. And I've come to such a level of trust in his sovereign leading of my life that I just can't wait to see what it is. I just feel impatient to know what it is that God wants me to do. But I believe that we can all contribute something to the spread of the gospel. Whether we can go or not, we can find ways that we can bless people and that our lives can contribute to God's work.
So you say international church is similar to the international school. There are churches that are English-speaking that are serving all these expats, they call them. And that's such a weird term to me. It sounds like they've draft dodged or something and ran out of the country. Like, I'm no longer an American. They need to come up with a different term than expatriate. It needs to be like transplanted patriot or something of that nature. But
well, the spelling of patriot is different than being a patriotic American.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
okay. See, that shows my ignorance of the term. But yes, an expat or whatever they call them. So these people are over in these countries on business doing these things, and there's churches that speak English.
Yes.
And you were telling me that most of these churches struggle to find pastors.
That's true.
So how many churches did you say internationally you know of that do not have a pastor right now?
There's about 15 or 20 churches that are just listed in the website that I went to. And English-speaking international churches, evangelical churches that are without pastors right now.
Are there any in Hawaii? Specifically the island of Kauai.
Yeah, right.
I've often told the Lord I will never serve you there, never. And he won't take the bait. Anyway, that's where they filmed the opening to Fantasy Island.
Oh.
And that's where they filmed Jurassic Park.
Okay.
And Blue Hawaii. Shall I go on?
No.
Okay. So you have researched. Okay, there's these international churches. They need a pastor. I'm English speaking. I'm an ordained elder in my church. I've been a missionary. So you're thinking, if the Lord allows, I'm going to go over to this church in this country. Where is it again? Malaysia?
Malaysia.
I'm going to go over to this church. I'm going to stay with them for a month. I'm going to preach. They're going to view me. They're going to interview me. They're going to try me out. And if the Lord allows, I may go over there and live and be their pastor.
Yeah. Why not?
That's incredible. Joe said,
It's exciting.
Joe said, I've got 10 good years left. So I'm going to go over there. And you're going to keep your house here.
Yes.
You said, I'm going to keep it so I'll have a place to come back to. But the great news is the Lord is allowing you to re-engage. So even though you lost your beautiful, wonderful wife, you're saying, but that now has freed me to go and be the pastor to these people.
Possibly, yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Man, I hope my chapters are like that. Not like that. I don't want to lose my wife, but I mean, I hope my chapters are exciting to where God uses me to the end.
Yeah.
I don't want to be sitting there watching Judge Judy.
Exactly.
And I'm not talking about Judy DeFriend.
Yeah, me either. I just want to have a life that's meaningful for eternity.
Yeah, what else is there?
Yeah.
Right. So just briefly, talk about this church. It's in a city. Give a little background there. If the Lord calls you there, where are you going to be moving?
Yeah, I'll not name the church right now because until this is a more permanent situation actually comes about, I would just be a little embarrassed if it didn't work out. I wouldn't want to have used the name of the church in any way that would be offensive to them. But this is the oldest international church in Malaysia. It's right downtown in Kuala Lumpur. It's about 1 hour from the NICS school in Kuala Lumpur. And my oldest son, Ben, and his family are there. He's the head of school at the NICS school there. And so it's about 1 hour away, but this is the church that he attends. And so I could end up being his pastor.
Well, that's probably one vote against you then.
It could be.
It's one vote against you.
It could be.
Yeah. So you also mentioned when you went over there to visit your son, because after your wife died, you just kind of went on a little tour of different countries and enjoyed that. And you said there were so many opportunities that you got to talk about Christ.
Yeah, I spent a week with each of my families. One of my sons and his family is in Korea, so I spent a week with them, and then I spent a week with Ben and his family in Malaysia. And then I took just 4 days, and I jumped over because it was so close. I had a bucket list item to see Angkor Wat, which is one of the ancient wonders of the world, the largest temple that's ever been built. So I spent a few days in Cambodia, and it was just amazing. Everywhere I went, it seemed like God put someone in my pathway to witness to talk to give some kind of testimony or some kind of word, that would bring God into the picture, and it was just so life-giving that I just felt like I was on a spiritual high the whole time, because it just reminded me of how true it is, that the laborers are few and the harvest is plentiful. And I just thought that this would be a great way to end life, just telling people about Jesus and having opportunities to share and opportunities to preach and opportunity to love on people. I do love people, and I just can't wait to see how God's going to open doors and close doors and redirect. And he's been doing that my whole life, and hopefully he doesn't have to use 2x4s as much as he used to.
Well, it's exciting. You got another chapter, Lord willing, that the Lord would use you.
Right.
And I hope that's all of our stories, that we all have chapters until the Lord is ready to be done with us, that we live well and we finish well.
Amen.
Right.
Amen.
Joe, thanks for being on Footnotes. And that concludes our episode for this time with our special guest, Joe Hale.